Hi everyone, my name is Nikki Armstrong and I am your instructor for the Hybrid Interpersonal Communications class, meeting roughly every other Saturday on campus at Normandale in the fall of 2015. Otherwise, we will be doing also half of the class online, and this is one aspect of it. So for any of the chapters in the syllabus that are assigned to you online, so we are not going over them in class, we'll have a lecture like this which goes over the most important information in that chapter. After you read the chapter and do your notes and watch this lecture, you should be in a good place to understand everything that chapter has to offer. So make sure that you have the 4th edition of The Key to Survival Interpersonal Communication by Tracy L. Smith and Mary Teague Busler. It should be a yellowish, orangish book. So chapter 1 is on Introduction to Communication. So it first talks about why we should even study communication to begin with. Why do we offer a class on interpersonal communication? And the purpose of the class is so that you can learn the elements necessary to communicate effectively with others, and that way it will allow you to understand when and how misinterpretations and miscommunications occur, which with miscommunications and misinterpretations, that's when conflict arises and fights arise. It will also allow you to see the role that you, others, and outside forces play in the sending and receiving of messages. So the book talks about the 4 major needs that are met by communication. So your first thing I want you to understand is communication is more than just person 1 talking to person 2. That's the most common form of communication when you think of it. But there are other forms of communication as well. There's something called intra, I-N-T-R-A, intra-communication, which is the communication you have with yourself. It's the communication you have with your brain. So your stomach tells your brain that it's hungry, so then your brain decides that you should go get something to eat. So communication meets your physical needs in this way, that if you didn't have the ability to communicate with yourself, you wouldn't know when you were hungry and thirsty. But also, if we're talking about communication, person A talking to person B, especially when you're little and even more so when you grow up, your physical needs will be more difficultly met without communication. Because if you don't communicate with the water company so they shut off your water, it's going to be hard for you to get water. So, okay, you could go to the store, but then going to the store, you're still going to have to more than likely communicate with the person that you're checking out with. If not, you're definitely going to have to communicate with the machine that you are swiping your card on. And in order to have money to put on that card to be able to purchase that water is another level of communication that you will have to have had at your job or whichever way you go about receiving that money. It also meets your practical needs. So that's very similar to your physical needs. So it's everything that you need to operate on a day-to-day basis. So communication, text messaging, communication, putting on your turn signal when you're driving. Practical, you watch the weather and get communication. It's going to be cold out, so you grab a jacket, or it's going to rain, so you grab an umbrella. Anything that you need to make it through your day-to-day life are practical needs that communication in some way, shape, or form meet. Now, the more easy to explain one, of course, communication meets your social needs. These are your need to belong, your need to be part of a group, part of a family, your need to be liked, your need to find the fellow Vikings or Green Bay Packer fans out there if you follow football. The need to find your fellow Harry Potter fans. I'm trying to think of other fandoms that are out there that you might want to meet, to belong, and to be part of. So any social needs, any need to belong will be met through communication. And then the last one that they talk about is your ego needs. Now, a lot of people think of ego as a negative thing, but it's really not. Ego at its heart is just what your self-worth is, what your self-esteem is. So your ego can be both helped and hurt by communication. So if you're receiving communication that's talking about how ugly you are, or you're receiving communication about how smart you are, these different things are going to affect your ego and affect your ego needs. But regardless, it is influenced and met by communication. The chapter then goes on to talk about some basic communication axioms. So the first one is communication takes work. Most of these I'm going to say productive communication axioms. But still, communication takes work. You can't just suddenly decide that you're going to communicate to somebody because if they don't know your language, if they don't know your sarcasm, if they don't know what's going on, if they've never spoken to you before, it's going to come across awkward or not able to be understood or just seen as weird. So communication, especially effective communication, takes a lot of work. Communication is not good or bad. So there are times when it might be a bad situation where communication will be helpful. There's sometimes when you're in a bad situation where communication is going to be more detrimental to what's going on. So it's important to understand that communication is not always good or bad, and that's not the point of communication. The point of communication is to relay a message. Now, whether that message is positive or negative, or has a positive or negative effect on you, is important, but when it just comes right down to communication, it is not inherently good or inherently bad. Every situation is going to influence it. When it comes right down to it, as long as a message is being sent, even if it's not received well, at least it's getting out there. So good or bad isn't nearly as important as the fact that communication is taking place. Communication takes time. This is one that's kind of similar to it takes work. Communication takes time. It's not something you can do in 10 seconds all the time. Now, you send a quick text message, you have a quick phone call, you see somebody in the hallway and you smile and say hi at them, yeah, that's not going to take up that much time. But to have a good, enriching conversation with somebody, or to make sure that your message, especially when it's a more complicated message, is truly understood by the other party, that's when it's going to take time. The next axiom is talking about communication as being dynamic. So what that is saying is communication is never one layered. There's always several different things that affect communication. So there's going to be some people who are stronger or more clear communicators. There are some people who might be weaker communicators. There are going to be people who have more nonverbals, some people who focus more on verbals. The bottom line is that communication is a layered thing that has several different dimensions that make each communication unique and each communicator unique. The next one is we've kind of covered it already, but it's talking about communication is essential. Without communication, we would cease to exist as even animals. We would just cease to exist altogether. If you woke up tomorrow and you couldn't communicate in any way, shape, or form, one, you would be dead because you couldn't communicate with your heart to beat or your lungs to pump. But if we assume even that little bit of communication is there, you still would not be able to survive if you couldn't communicate with anybody else or anything else around you. Communication is a mutual process. So what that is saying is that there has to be a sender and a receiver of the communication. So sometimes that can be the same person. So you can send a message to yourself or you can send a message to somebody else. But then whoever receives that message then is going to communicate back to you in some way, shape, or form. Respond in some way. Your stomach sends a message to your brain saying you're hungry. Your brain sends a message back to your stomach that says, don't worry, we'll get food in you. Or we're busy right now, but we'll feed you later. You talk to somebody, they nod their head to let you know that they've heard what you have to say. And then lastly, communication is a learned skill. This is more specifically that communication is a positive or effective communication is a learned skill. It's not something that people can immediately do. Yes, we grow up from birth crying, and that's a form of communicating, but to have effective communication specifically between two people, it is very much a learned skill that takes practice and takes time to truly understand. So this next little picture here is talking about this is getting into basic communication terms, but it's talking about how messages are sent and received. So the very first thing you have is you have the sender who's going to encode or send a message through a channel, which is then going to be decoded by the receiver. Source 1, hi, how are you? That's what they're encoding. It goes through the message. It's decoded by the receiver. The receiver hears, hi, how are you? So then they will probably respond with, I'm good, or I'm all right, or what have you, and that goes through the same idea back to the sender or receiver. But there are several different things that can influence this area of messages being sent and received. So the first thing to notice is the sender's field of experience, the receiver's field of experience. So when the sender asks the receiver, "How are you?" and the receiver responds with, "I'm fine," maybe to the sender's field of experience is whenever anybody says they're fine, they're really not fine. But maybe for the receiver, when she says she's fine, that means that she's okay, that everything's good. So now all of a sudden you have a miscommunication because the sender's field of experience about what fine means and the receiver's field of experience about what fine means are different. The final thing that can also drastically affect the sending and receiving and responding of a message is noise. We'll go into more detail about that in a later chapter, but noise is either the environmental, so the physical noises that are interrupting it, but also the psychological noises, like things you are thinking in your own head or arguments you are crafting or your own needs not being met. There are lots of different forms of noise, and like I said, we will go more into detail with those in a little bit. So, why is the message that's sent not necessarily the message that is received? So I talked about some of these already. The sender and receiver do not share personal environments. It could be that the sender did not properly encode the message, meaning that the person sending the message was unclear about what they were trying to share, or the receiver got distracted by noise so they weren't able to properly decode the message. So I want to take, since I have a little bit of time here and I'm not 100% sure we're going to get to it anywhere else, I want to go back here and talk about noise. So the most common type of noise, or when people hear noise, the word noise, what they tend to think about is what we call environmental noise. So that's the hum of an air conditioner, that's a cell phone going off, that's somebody shifting in their chair and the chair squeaking. That's environmental noise. The next type of noise is the psychological noise. So that's the own arguments you are having in your head. So whether you're disagreeing with what's being said, or you're thinking about what you have to do next, or you're wondering when this is going to be over with, that's psychological noise. Then you have physiological noise. So basic needs of yours, if they aren't met, that's what you're going to be concentrating on instead of the message being received. So if you hadn't eaten in 2 days, you're not going to give a flying fig Newton what I have to share about. All you're going to care about is when can you get food again. Or if you're too hot or too cold, you're going to be focused more on that than on the message being sent. The fourth and final type of noise is what I call behavioral noise. Behavioral noise is when the person sending the message does something that makes the message hard to understand. So maybe they have an accent. Maybe they talk too fast or too slow. Maybe they have too many vocal pauses. Maybe their enunciation isn't crisp and clear. Maybe they gesture too much. If there's something that the sender is doing with their voice or with their body that is distracting you from the message they are sending, that is the fourth type of noise. So with that, that brings us to the end of chapter 1. The next lecture will be on chapter 2. So stay tuned. That should be posted here shortly.